Hello and welcome to this session. This is Module 11 in Educational Psychology, and within this module we will be focusing on instructional planning. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie and welcome to this week's lecture. Now, instructional planning is the systematic selection of educational goals and objectives, and they're designed for use within the classroom. At the most general or abstract level, the goals of education include philosophical ideas like developing individuals to their fullest potential and preparing students to be productive members of society. Few teachers would disagree with these ideas in principle, though they might disagree about their wording or about their relative importance. As a practical matter, however, teachers might have trouble translating such generalities into specific lesson plans or activities for the next day's class. What does it mean concretely to develop an individual to the student's fullest potential? What does it mean that a language arts teacher should ask students to write an essay about their personal interests? What does it mean that the teacher should help students learn to write as well as possible on any topic, even ones that are not immediately of interest? What exactly should a teacher do from day to day to prepare students to be productive members of society? Answers to questions like these are needed to plan instruction effectively, but the answers aren't obvious simply by examining statements of general educational goals. Teachers need a detailed activity, and they're more likely to be met by a curriculum guide, a document devoted to graphic descriptions of activities that foster or encourage the specific skills explained in a curriculum framework document. The descriptions may mention a list of curriculum goals served by an activity, but they are also likely to specify materials that a teacher needs, the time requirements for grouping students, drawing or diagrams of key equipment or materials, or sometimes even suggestions for what to say to students at different points during the activity. And in these ways, the descriptions may resemble lesson plans. Since classroom activities often support more than one specific skill, activities in a curriculum guide may be organized differently than they might be in a framework document. Instead of highlighting only one standard at a time, as the framework document might, activities may be grouped more loosely. For example, according to the dominant purpose or goal of an activity, or according to a dominant piece of equipment or material. Given curriculum frameworks and guides, how do you choose and formulate actual learning objectives? Basically, there are two approaches. Either start by selecting content or topics that you want your students to know, the cognitive approach, or start with what students do, the behavioral approach. In effect, the cognitive approach moves from the general to the specific, and the behavioral approach does it in the opposite way. Now, each approach will have its advocates, and each has its inherent strengths and its problems. In practice, teachers can combine or alternate between the orders that they give to students and take advantage of each of these. Now, from general to specific, the cognitive approach assumes the teachers normally have a number of long-term general goals for students, and it begins with those goals. It also assumes that each student will work toward long-term general goals along different paths and using different styles of learning. And because of these assumptions, it's necessary to name indicators which are examples of specific behaviors by which students might show success at reaching a general learning goal. But it is neither desirable nor possible for a list of indicators to be complete, only for it to be representative. Now, for example, you might have the goal of the students will understand the nature and purpose of photosynthesis, and the indicators might be that they explain the purpose of photosynthesis in a steps process, that they might create diagrams that indicate the chemical process, that they describe how a plant photosynthesis affects the animal world, and so on. The cognitive approach from general to specific is reasonable, at least on the face of it, and in fact probably describes how a lot of teachers think about instructional planning. But there are always going to be critics. And there's always going to be examples that may not, in fact, clarify the general goal enough. Students will therefore end up unexpectedly at some place else. And given the general goal of understanding photosynthesis that I just mentioned, how are we to know whether the indicators that are listed really allow a teacher to grasp the full meaning of the goal? Now, we can look at it a different way. As I mentioned, we can use the behavioral objectives approach, where we start with the specific and move to the general. So compared to the cognitive approach, the behavioral approach to instructional planning reverses the steps in planning. Instead of starting with general goal statements accompanied by indicator examples, it starts with identification of specific behaviors, concrete actions or words that the student should perform or display as a result of instruction. And collectively, the specific behaviors may describe a more general educational goal. But unlike the indicators used in the cognitive approach, they are not a mere sampling of the possible specific outcomes. Instead, they represent all of the intended specific outcomes. So when we think in terms, for example, of the objectives of learning to use inline rollerblade skates, the different indicators might be: student ties the boots correctly, the student puts on their safety gear correctly, they put on their helmet and their knee pads and their elbow pads correctly, the student can skate 15 meters on a level ground without falling, and so on. Now, behavioral objectives have obvious advantages because they're clear and they're precise. And they seem especially well suited for learning where the nature of the topic is spelled out explicitly and fully, such as when a student is learning to drive a car or use safety equipment in a science lab or install and run a particular computer program. And most of these goals, as it happens, also tend to be relatively short learning cycles, meaning that they can be learned as a result of just one lesson or one activity, or of just a short series of such lessons. Now, such goals tend not to include larger, more abstract goals of education. Now, in practice, both kinds of goals, the general and the specific, form a large part of education at all grade levels. What I would suggest when thinking about these approaches is to think about both long-term general goals and short-term immediate objectives. A thorough, balanced look at most school curricula shows that they are concerned with the general as well as the specific. So in teaching elementary math, for example, you may want students to learn general problem-solving strategies, a general goal, but you may also want them to learn specific math facts, a specific goal. In teaching Shakespeare's plays in high school, you may want students to be able to compare the plays critically, a general goal, but also may require that they learn details of the characters and plots of the major plays, a specific objective. Since general goals usually take longer to reach than specific goals, the instructional planning has to include both time frames. Plan for what students do, not what the teacher does. This idea may seem obvious, but it is easy to overlook as you're devising your lesson plans. Consider, for example, again, that about teaching Shakespeare. If you want students to learn the details about Shakespeare's plays, it's tempting to plan objectives like summarize the plot of each play to students, or write and hand out to students an outline of plays. Unfortunately, these objectives describe only what the teacher does and makes the assumption, and often an unwarranted assumption, that students will remember what the teacher says or puts in writing for them. A better version of the same objective should focus on the actions of the students and not the teacher. Now, let's think in terms of the different taxonomies of educational objectives. When educators have proposed taxonomies of educational objectives, they tend to focus on one of three areas or domains of psychological functioning. Either the student's cognition, their thought, students' feelings and emotions, their affect, or students' physical skills, their psychomotor abilities. And of these three, they've tended to focus more on cognition. But an taxonomy originated by Benjamin Bloom deals entirely with cognitive outcomes of instruction. So when we look at Bloom's taxonomy of educational goals, it refers to forms of cognition or thinking, which are divided into 6 levels. But we should also think about other ways of looking at the student. There are taxonomies related to affect, or the feelings and emotions of students. And these are used less commonly than cognitive taxonomies for planning instruction. But various educators have constructed them because they can be useful. Now, one of the most widely known was published by a colleague of Benjamin Bloom and classifies affect according to how committed a student feels toward what the student is learning. And in thinking in terms of that, you are engaging the student's emotional self. Now, taxonomies related to abilities and skills that are physical or psychomotor have also been used, less widely than affective taxonomies, with the notable exception of one area of teaching that they are obviously relevant, and that is in physical education or kinesiology. And as you might expect, taxonomic categories of motor skills extend from simple brief actions to complex, extended action sequences that combine simpler, previously learned skills smoothly and automatically. Now, so far we've talked about, or rather we've ignored the obvious variety and diversity of students. But we always need to remember that diversity is a reality that every teacher needs to recognize. Whether goals and plans we make, some students learn the material sooner and better than others. Now, for any given goal or objective, some students need more time than others in order to learn. And any particular teaching strategy will prove more effective than some students than others. Effective teaching requires differentiated instruction, providing different materials, arrangements, and strategies with different students. The differentiation can include unique structural arrangements in the school, such as special tutoring for individuals or special classes for small groups needing particular extra help. Differentiation can also include extra attention or coaching within a classroom for individual students or small groups. One of the most widely used approaches for differentiating instruction is called response to intervention, or RTIs. Like other forms of differentiation, RTIs begin with the premise that students differ widely in how they learn and the extent of their learning. It also assumes that a central part of teaching is response to these differences, and to do so as promptly as possible. To achieve this purpose, RTI programs typically frame educational interventions around 3 levels that we call tiers. Tier 1 instruction involves efforts to teach an entire class in the most efficient ways, and ways that are good bets for being effective with the majority of students. Now, using Tier 1 strategies, for example, are a teacher might sometimes explain new ideas to the whole class, but also put students into small groups for selected projects and give them individual seat work or homework to do. Okay, so that's Tier 1. Then Tier 2 instruction involves additional time or material for the relatively small number of students who do not learn from Tier 1 methods. Typically involves additional work in small groups or even individual tutoring with the classroom, within the classroom by the teacher or an educational assistant or a peer or an adult volunteer. And then there's Tier 3 instruction. And this is reserved for the even smaller number of students that still do not learn even from Tier 2 instruction. And it's likely to involve special classes or individual tutoring outside of classes, using special education teachers or educational assistants hired for this purpose. Tier 3 instruction is therefore more resource intensive than Tier 2 instruction, which is in turn more resource intensive than Tier 1 instruction. Now, I want you to think in terms of students as a source of instructional goals. We've talked about instructional goals as goals and objectives as if they are selected primarily by educators and teachers and not by students themselves. And this assumption is usually correct, but there are problems with it. One problem is that choosing goals and objectives for students rather than by students places a major burden on everyone involved in education: curriculum writers, teachers, and students. The curriculum writers have to make sure that they specify standards, goals, and objectives that are truly important for the student to learn. But what if it really doesn't matter? For example, whether a science student learns about the periodic table of elements. Teachers have to make sure that students actually become motivated to learn the specific goals and objectives, even if the students are not motivated initially. Students have to master preset goals and objectives, even if they might not have chosen them personally. Now, there's some critics of education have argued that these requirements can be serious impediments to learning. The problems are widespread and especially notable in two forms of teaching. One is with the youngest students, who may especially lack patience with an educational agenda set by others. The other is with culturally diverse classrooms, where students and their families may hold a variety of legitimate but unconventional expectations about what they should learn. In response to concerns like these, some educators advocate planning instruction around goal sets or expressed either by students themselves or by the cultures or communities within which the student identifies. Now, these suggestions vary in detail, but can be organized into two broad categories. First, an emergent curriculum, and second, multicultural and anti-bias curriculum. Now, an emergent curriculum is one that explicitly builds on interests expressed by students rather than goals set by curriculum writers, curriculum documents, or teachers. Now, as you might suspect, therefore, instructional planning for an emergent curriculum does not have the same meaning that the term has had up until this point. Instead, since an emergent curriculum by definition unfolds spontaneously and flexibly, student interests may be predictable, but usually not very far in advance. Now, for example, a first grade teacher plans a unit around Halloween, and that as one of the activities for this unit, she reads a book about Halloween. In listening to the book, however, the students turn out to be less interested in its Halloween content than in the fact that one of the illustrations within the book shows a picture of a full moon partially hidden by clouds. They begin asking about the moon. Why is it full sometimes but not at others? Why it rises in different places each month, and whether the moon really moves behind clouds or whether the clouds actually do the moving. The teacher encourages their questions and their interests in moon astronomy, and over the next days and weeks, the teacher arranges further activities and experiences to encourage the students' interests. She sets aside her original plans about Halloween and finds books about the moon and about the solar system, and maybe contacts a local expert, an astronomer, and they explore that. The important thing within an emergent curriculum is that there needs to be continuous observation of students. The teacher watches and listens and makes informal written records of students' comments and activities. And all of this helps to create a flexible learning environment. Now, a second strategy that facilitates teachers' success within this emergent curriculum is curriculum webbing, a process of brainstorming connections among initiatives suggested by students and ideas suggested by the teacher. Now, in some cases, webs can be created jointly with students by brainstorming with them about where their current interests may lead. In other cases, they can be created independently by the teacher's own reflections. In still others, when a classroom has more than one adult responsible for it, they can be created jointly by the teaching team. Now, to some, emergent curriculums may seem like a formula for curriculum or classroom management disaster, but the approach has often proved to be quite successful, and it encourages freshness within the classroom, and that can be exciting for the teacher as well as the student. Then we have multicultural or anti-bias education. Now, a culture is an all-encompassing set of values, beliefs, practices, and customs of a group or community. It's a total way of life. Cultures may be shared widely, even by much, if not all, of an entire nation, or they may be shared by relatively few, such as a small community within a large city. Sometimes the term culture is even applied to the way of life of an individual family or of a specialized group in society. And some might argue, for example, that there is a culture of schooling shared by teachers, though not necessarily by all students. Because culture by definition touches on all aspects of living, it is likely to affect students' perspectives about school, their ways of learning, and their motivations to learn. The differences go beyond obvious differences in holidays, language, or food preferences. In some cultures, for example, individuals keep good eye contact with someone with whom they are speaking and expect the same from others. In other cultures, such behavior is considered intrusive or overly aggressive, and avoiding eye contact while speaking is considered to be more respectful. Now, to be fully effective, therefore, instructional planning has to take into account the diversity of students' cultural backgrounds and whether the differences are observable or subtle. Planning also has to work deliberately to reduce the social biases and prejudices that sometimes develop about cultural differences. Multicultural education and anti-bias education are two terms referring to these purposes. Their meanings often overlap significantly depending on the context or on who is using the terms. Generally, though, the first term, multicultural education, has somewhat more to do with understanding the differences among cultures. The latter term, anti-bias education, has more to do with overcoming social prejudices and biases resulting from cultural differences. Now, for convenience, we can use the term multicultural education to refer to both differences and overcoming prejudice. Fully effective multicultural education has several features. The most obvious and familiar one is content integration. The curriculum uses examples and information from different cultures to illustrate different concepts or ideas already contained in the curriculum. But there is more to cultural education, multicultural education, than integrating content from diverse cultures. Among other features, it also requires an equity pedagogy, which is an effort to allow and even encourage a variety of learning styles, styles at which students may have become skilled because of their cultural background. Now, in elementary language arts, for example, there may be more than one best way to tell a story. Should a student necessarily have to tell it alone and standing in front of the whole class? Or might the student tell it jointly with a friend or in a smaller group? All of these should be considered. Now, choosing a story form also points toward another feature of multicultural education, the knowledge construction process, which is the unstated, unconscious process by which a cultural group creates knowledge or information. Now, the popular media, for example, will often portray, in the US, Hispanic Americans in ways that are stereotypical, either subtle or blatantly. Now, a fully multicultural curriculum finds ways to call these images to the attention of students and to engage them in thinking about how and why the images are oversimplified. Yet there's even more to fully multicultural education. In addition to content integration, equity pedagogy, and knowledge construction, it fosters prejudice reduction, or activities, discussions, and readings that identify students' negative evaluations of cultural groups. The activities and discussions can, of course, take a somewhat philosophical approach, examining how students feel in general, what experiences they remember having involving prejudice, and the like. But the activities and discussions can also take a more indirect and subtle form, as when teachers periodically speak in a student's native language, as a public sign of respect for the student. Gestures and discussions like these are especially effective if they contribute to an even deeper element of multicultural education, which is empowering the school and the social structure. When you integrate this into the integration of respecting cultural differences into extracurricular and sports activities, you deepen the learning even more. Next, I want to talk a little bit about whether instructional goals originate from curriculum documents, student-expressed interests, or a mixture of both. Students are more likely to achieve the goals if teachers will draw on a wide variety of resources. Now, as a practical matter, this means looking for materials and experiences that supplement or even replace the most traditional forms of education, which are textbooks. And precisely what resources to use depends on factors unique to the class, to the school, to the community, and to the students. Now, the internet is certainly a fixture within our lives, and it will continue to grow in its importance. And so it is important to use this as a tool to help students identify ways of using different search engines. And there are other search engines than Google, but also accessing databases, for example, university databases, and finding and identifying good, credible sites that can help with the learning process. And not only that, but using the internet for communication with others. creating a learning commons, establishing a website that is kind of like a physical space where students can connect and learn from each other and tutor each other and support each other. The other thing that you can do is use local experts and field trips. Local experts can come in and visit and share their experiences, and in so doing, they will expose the student to environmental issues, academic issues, cultural issues, and this can go a long way to igniting and motivating the urge within students to learn. Field trips as well. They are a lot of work, they take a lot of planning, but they can be a powerful influence in the lives of students. And then finally, service learning. You can incorporate service learning where you engage in real community service activities and then analyze what you do in those service learning times and reflect upon the significance of those activities. Something as simple as picking up trash on an urban stream bed can lead into ecological environment and biology and social justice. All of that can be a very powerful opportunity for encouraging the student to continue to learn. In all of these, to succeed then, instructional plans require a variety of resources. We can get them to connect with prior experiences and knowledge. They can connect with the whole world using the internet. They can connect with local experts, or by taking field trips, or by engaging in service learning. And in all of these things, the teacher is continually connecting the curriculum to the students' experiences. And when we combine this, there are techniques that are ready at hand that simply require the teacher to develop a habit of looking for opportunities to use them. And these are modeling behavior and modeling representations of ideas, activating prior learning knowledge that's already familiar to the students, anticipating preconceptions held by students, and providing guided and independent practice. Now, modeling refers to performing or demonstrating a desired new behavior or skill, as when a teacher or classmate demonstrates polite behaviors or the correct solution to a math problem. And in this case, we say that the teacher or classmate models the desired behavior, either deliberately or in the course of other ongoing activities. The students observe the model behavior and hopefully imitate it for themselves. Now, there's another meaning to modeling. A model is a simplified representation of a phenomenon that incorporates the important properties of the phenomenon. But models can also be imaginary, though still based on familiar elements. In a science curriculum, for example, the behavior of gas molecules under pressure can be modeled by imagining the molecules as ping pong balls flying about and colliding in an empty room. Reducing the space available to the gas by making the room smaller affects the ping pong balls to collide more frequently and vigorously, and thereby increasing the pressure on the walls of the room. Increasing the space has the opposite effect, creating an actual room full of ping pong balls. While it might be impractical, still allows that model to be used. Now, we can also think in terms of activating students' prior knowledge. And here we're talking about encouraging students to recall what they know already about new material that is being learned. And there's a lot of different formats for activating prior knowledge. When introducing a unit about how biologists classify animal or plant species, for example, a teacher can invite students to discuss how they already classify different plants and animals. You can create concept maps, and this can all go a long way to activating prior learning. And then there's guided practice. And in so doing, when students first learn a new skill or a new set of ideas, they are especially likely to encounter problems and make mistakes. And this can interfere with the very process of learning. And in figuring out how to use, for example, new software program, a student can very quickly get lost and discouraged. And so students initially need guided practice. And here we have opportunities to work independently, but with a teacher or with an expert at hand to prevent or to fix any difficulties that come along. And so guided practice allows for autonomy, but also to avoid the ideas of getting stuck on a small problem that can quickly and easily be fixed with a few words from a teacher. And then we have the ideas of independent practice. And independent practice is opportunities to review and repeat their knowledge at their own pace and with few interruptions. And at this point, guided practice may feel less like help than like an interruption. And so students might prefer to simply work on their own. And so, for example, they might work at home with their computer. And that brings us to homework then. There are always chances to experience lots of forms of homework. Widespread practice of assigning review work to do outside of school is a way of supplementing the scarce time in class and to provide independent practice for students. Now, homework has generated a lot of controversy over the years, and I do want you to be mindful of that we can't be taking up all of a student's time outside of school. But at the same time, it provides an opportunity for the student to develop a skill in working alone and being able to complete a task with minimal supervision and sometimes with minimal additional training to simply work away at the tasks, and in so doing to consolidate the learning into their long-term memory. So in summary, broad educational goals for most subject areas, while they're published by the government, there is some flexibility within them. They can formulate curriculum topics and break things down into different taxonomies of educational objectives. But within those curriculums, you as the teacher have the opportunity to be flexible and to use different approaches to keep things fresh for you, to keep things fresh for your students, and it's always important to draw upon lots of resources. You always want to be mindful that you want to be working towards social justice, to keep students' cultures alive and well. So having an emergent curriculum is valuable. Having a multicultural and anti-bias curriculum is important. It's also important to draw in lots of resources, using the internet, using local experts, using field trips, engaging in surface learning are all strategies that can be used, as well as fleshing out the students' experiences through judicious use of modeling, of activating prior knowledge, of anticipation of students' preconceptions, and of appropriate blends of guided and independent practice. And all of this can help you to continue to enjoy teaching and enrich the lives of your students. And that's it for this lecture.